Hi, this is Jove Aguas once again, and welcome to my lectures. This is the fourth and last part of my lectures in Oriental conceptions of reality. So I will focus in this lecture on two things. First, the conception of reality in Chinese philosophy in general, and then I will move to a discussion on Confucianism. Uh, the first part is to provide us with some kind of an overview of what we may call Chinese metaphysics, although that term is rather quite problematic, as we are going to discuss later. So, let me start with the Chinese theory on reality. As I have already said, it is quite problematic to think of theories on reality or a kind of metaphysics in Chinese philosophy, as if we are going to compare it to the Western philosophical traditions. In fact, the whole of the Oriental system or the Oriental tradition, it's quite difficult to come up with a kind of metaphysics based on their doctrines. If you're going to think of metaphysics as a kind of a theory that will explain what being or reality is. Because as we have discussed in the previous parts of this lecture, Hinduism and Buddhism and in Taoism, um, their theories about reality is very much different from the way metaphysics is conceived in Western philosophy. If we use or if we go back to Aristotle, for example, as we are going to cover also Aristotle in this course, Aristotle focused more on the notion of what being is. Okay, what is being? What is substance? What are the principles of reality like uh, uh, act and potency, matter and form, etc., etc. But if we go back to our previous discussions on Oriental conceptions of reality, hardly we can find this kind of categorization of reality. You may find some uh, distinctions, like for example, distinction made between Brahman and Atman, between the two realities in Buddhism. Uh, the Atman and Brahman is in Hinduism. And even when we talk about the distinction between yin and yang in Taoism, or of course that's in Chinese philosophy in general, hardly we really consider this as totally different or totally opposite. At best, they are opposite, but they are relational or relative. So it's rather different, rather quite complicated to think of the theories on reality uh, in the Western sense and the theories of reality in the Oriental sense. In the Oriental, we don't have this kind of divisions in philosophy where we say that this part of philosophy is on ethics or is on epistemology or metaphysics, which we do in Western philosophy. So of course, if since philosophy now is more dominated by the Western discourse, then they apply these Western conceptions or Western categorizations of philosophy to the understanding and appreciation of Oriental philosophy. Okay, so again, going back to the Chinese theory on reality, what we can consider to be theories on reality cannot be separated from other areas of philosophy, like, for example, ethics, cosmology, and even politics, because these are all integrated into the Chinese thought. The main preoccupation of Chinese thinkers is the relation of man and society, or the relation of man with nature. Okay, or how can man be a good member of society? And therefore, the metaphysical speculation is often subsumed or related to the ethical and political speculation. Furthermore, metaphysical concepts are often associated with physical and cosmological concepts. So, for example, yes, we talk about the yin and the yang, the Tao, the Wu Wei. The yin and yang may be a cosmological concept, but this is also a metaphysical concept. Okay, of course, we can also say that in Western philosophy, like for example, when you talk of matter and form in Aristotelian metaphysics, for example, and in Aquinas metaphysics, this can also be applied to nature, okay, to the physical reality. But this this very significant connection association between the cosmological or among the cosmological, the physical and metaphysical in Chinese thought is very much pronounced. Okay, and it's not only in Chinese philosophy that we see that, even in Hinduism and in Buddhism, those philosophies coming from India. Okay, so that's something that is common among the Oriental thoughts. That the conception of reality is so integrated, no, so holistic in a sense. So, in the ethical front, the most important concepts, of course, are focused on the virtues and living harmoniously and being productive in society. That's the concepts of humanity, righteousness, love, what else? Respect for the elders, following the rituals and traditions are very important. In the cosmological side, the focus was on the way or the path, the Tao, heaven or Tian, cosmic elements of tranquility, the activity of the yin and yang, etc. But there is a general position that somehow underlies the history of Chinese philosophy, and that is the unity of man and heaven. Okay, so if there is a rather general theory that underlies the Chinese thought, it's the unity, the harmony between man and heaven. Okay, and we are going to discuss this later when we discuss that part on Confucianism. So let us go historical here in our discussion of the conception of reality in Chinese thought. During the ancient period, the Shang dynasty, it's about 7th to 11th century before the Common Era, thought was based on cyclicity. Maybe the cycle of the weather or of the what do you call this, of the climate, or the cycle that we find in nature. So from the observation of the cycles of day and night, the changing of the seasons, the moon, the movement of the moon, we can see this kind of cycle in nature. And during this period, both gods and ancestors were worshipped, and there were human and animal sacrifices offered to the gods and the ancestors. And heaven was seen as a force controlling the world, including the society and the state. Heaven was a kind of impersonal, high ancestral deity. Life and death, fortune and poverty depended upon the will of heaven. So this is pretty much like the kind of belief or the myth of the Greeks, that the gods, in the case of the Chinese, heaven, for the Greeks, the gods in Mount Olympus, they control the faith of the humans. Of course, there's a difference between, in the Greek, the gods, they can actually, they are personal, and they can actually relate with the humans. In fact, they have fathered uh, some demigods. Okay, but in the case of the ancient Chinese, this the heaven is a kind of an impersonal, high deity, but much nonetheless, what happens to man is controlled by heaven. Now, the Shang people have believed in Shangdi. The Shangdi is the tribal lord who was the greatest ancestor and the supreme deity who protected them in battles, sanctioned their undertakings, and sent them rewards and punishments. And the people also prayed to their ancestors for the solution of their problems. But the Shangdi is the highest, the ultimate, no, the supreme deity. Okay? Now that was during the time of the Shang dynasty. The next dynasty is the Shu dynasty. And during this dynasty, a new society, well, of course, there is progress and development. And the new society required new tools, new talents, new methods, new ways of dealing with reality. And the Shu people turned to man, meaning turned to themselves, although they still honored their ancestors. But instead of praying to the ancestors for solutions to their problems, they turned to themselves. They turned to themselves, they worked and relied on their skills and talents. So, during the Shu dynasty, the belief in the Shangdi was gradually supplanted by the notion of heaven as Tian, as a supreme spiritual reality. So, the Shangdi's anthropomorphic character decreased, and its wishes were now expressed not in unpredictable whims, but in what they call the mandate of heaven or Tianming. This mandate was based on man's virtue or de or power. Okay, in our discussion in Taoism, I mentioned this virtue of de. Okay, now the concept of the mandate of heaven now held that heaven would bless the authority of a just ruler, but would be displeased with an unwise ruler and retract the mandate if he will not be a virtuous ruler. So now it becomes, there's a change. Instead of before, it is the pleasure of the god of the Shangdi that determines the fate of people. Now it is man determining what will be the reward that heaven would give him. So it's now based on the virtue. If you're a good person, then you will be rewarded by heaven. If you're a bad person, you will not be rewarded by heaven. Right? So this applies to everybody, but most especially to the ruler. If you if you develop your day, if you develop your virtue, then heaven will bless you. But if not, then you cannot. The heaven will not bless you. So the whole point is you need to develop your virtue. And as I've said, this notion of the mandate of heaven is very much applicable to the ruler. So among the humans, the ruler is regarded as the son of heaven, the Chanchi, and he has the most intimate relationship with heaven. So heaven had bestowed upon him the heavenly mandate, the Chan Ming, which allows him to rule and supports him in this in his in his position. So if he is responsible, then heaven will support him. Otherwise, if the ruler does not follow his mandate, his obligation, does not rule virtuously, then he can be, he can be replaced, he will no longer enjoy the mandate of heaven. So the ruler is always obliged to take over this rule with the necessary feeling of responsibility. And he had to avoid at all means to make people suffer, no? To make people suffer either by devastation, exploitation, or even natural disasters. So, in general, the rewards and punishments obtained from heaven dependent on man's virtue. As it is said, heaven is always kind to the virtuous, and therefore man's virtue became the determining factor whether he enjoys the blessing of heaven or not. So now man could control his own destiny or his own Ming by being virtuous. Now, it is said that this mandate of heaven, Tianming, was a metaphysical concept to legitimize rule invented by the Shu dynasty, to shift the focus away from the ancestry to rule by modes of behavior or performances in leadership. Confucian interpreters defined power, the De, as the moral standard of benevolence, foremost among them. So that there is a power, a virtue. And this is where the Confucian virtues of benevolence, righteousness, trustworthiness, and other virtues, Ren, the Li, the Yi, the Xiao, etc. So the mandate is given to the leader, again, who view by virtue. Great heaven has no partial affection. It helps only the virtuous. Now, in the latter tradition, especially in the teaching of the philosopher Mengzu, the people is seen as heaven's eyes and ears. Heaven sees as my people see, it is said. Heaven hears as my people hear. So it was the utmost duty of a ruler to serve his people. And whenever the people complained or rebelled, it is high time to change politics. Therefore, whatever the people desires, the people or the heaven will accord it. Okay? So that's the during the ancient time, from the Shang to the Shu dynasty. Well, there is first the notion of heaven as an impersonal deity who controls the fate of the people. But later in the succeeding dynasty, this notion of heaven was changed into the mandate of heaven, and this is based on virtue. Okay. Now, around the middle, so now let's go to the next point here. What many scholars call the cosmogenic turn. Okay, the cosmogenic turn. Around the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, a radical shift in focus in Chinese thought happened when Chinese philosophers started to ask questions about the origin and development of the universe or reality. They questioned how the diverse things of the world arise and take form. Now, there's something uh, very important here, very crucial here. If you're going to compare how the thought, the Chinese thought developed, or Chinese philosophy developed, if you're going to compare that to the Greeks, because in Greek philosophy, the very first question that the pre-Socratics philosophers asked was, what is the basic world stuff? The question was on cosmology, on the nature of cosmos. And then later on, when Socrates arrived, he changed the focus of philosophy from question of the cosmos to the question of the self, the know thyself. Okay, so it's rather that's one difference we can say between the development of Chinese thought and the Greek thought, because in Chinese the first question was how can we live a moral life? How can we be good persons, virtuous persons, etc., etc. And then later on, they shifted the focus to what is the origin of the world. In Greek philosophy, it was what is the basic world stuff, and then later on, the question about ethics, morality came in. But anyway, let's continue with this discussion on the cosmogenic turn in Chinese thought. This is what commentators refer to as the cosmogenic turn in Chinese philosophy. Although Lao Tzu has covered this in the Tao Te Ching, because that's one of the earliest texts in Chinese philosophy, of course, there were also other philosophers who focused on this matter. Okay, and this cosmogenic turn constituted a break with anthropomorphism and a shift from the humanistic values like rightness, yi, or ritual propriety, the li, or the ren, benevolence, and a move towards concerns with maintaining life, inducing desires, and acting spontaneously. Concepts that, of course, have already been the focus of Taoism. Okay? Of course, it's not to say that it was Confucius who came up with all the virtues, the human virtues. Well, he made it the central piece of his philosophy. But you know, uh, many people now are, at least at this point, they were more concerned with cosmology rather than with ethics. Okay, of course, before that, there was already Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching who already thought of uh, the Tao, spontaneity, simplicity, naturalness, which are important to maintaining life. But during the middle of the fourth century for the Common Era, there was a kind of going back to the to the previous concern or questions about the origin of the universe. So, according to writers, this cosmogenic turn or this cosmogonies, a cosmogony is a theory about the origin of the universe or the origin of the cosmos. Okay, so they share four basic assumptions. One, that the diverse things of the world ultimately can be traced back to a single source. So, all Chinese thinkers who discuss ultimate origins took that origin to be unique. The best known name for this source is the Tao, of course, okay, which means the path, the way, or guide. So, that's uh, uh, that makes this concept of the Chinese thought as a kind of this origin points to a singular, unique cause, whatever that cause is. The other name for this unique uh, unique origin, aside from the Tao, is the term Tai Chi, or the supreme polarity. And the term Tai Chi appears in the Yi Ching as the original unity from which yin and yang emerge. Yes, of course, there are some ambiguity in saying that the ultimate origin is one. If we go back to our discussion on Taoism, uh, the one is the Tao. The Tao is the one. But Lao Tzu also said that the one generates the two. That's the yin yang, which generates three, and then the myriad of things, the multiplicity of things. But he also claims that the one itself is not the ultimate. So there is some ambiguity in saying that the ultimate origin is one. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says that the one is the yi. The one, the yi, it generates the two, which generates the three, and then the myriad or multiplicity of things, but claims that the one itself is not the ultimate. The one is not the ultimate because it is generated from the Tao. So sometimes the one is translated as the Tao, or sometimes it is not. So in another part of the Tao Te Ching, he says that things are born from being, the you, but being is generated from the non-being, the Wu. Remember the Wu Wei theory, nothing. So there are some complexity in interpreting these texts. Now, anyway, uh, the generation of things happen spontaneously without design or purpose. So there is an ultimate reality, and that reality is unique. And second, how things are generated, they are spontaneous without any purpose or design. So if you take, for example, the Wu Wei, the non-being, the no being as indeterminacy, then the problem of a first cause is not, it's not getting many from one or getting, something from nothing, but rather how differentiation emerges from the undifferentiated. So to avoid an infinite regress of causes, one, so we can go back, if we trace back to the first origin, there will be regress of causes because A is caused by this, then caused by that, and then this, and then that, and so on and so forth. So the only possibility is to stop at something that, just as the way it is from its own being. Is to say, well, so how do this particular thing came about, and how about this thing, how about this thing, etc., etc. Well, to end that is just to say, well, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. Okay? So the role of the concept of Zeran is similar to the role of causa sui, self-cause, meaning it happened that way because it is caused by itself. Now, there are two important points here. First, existence is seen not in terms of abstract being, but rather as sheng, meaning life or growth, birth, vitality. The Chinese philosophy lacks ontology, the kind of Western metaphysics that we employ, because philosophers were never concerned with being as such or being as something that is abstract. Okay? It is more accurate to say that the Chinese philosophers took dynamic organization as a kind of, as the very nature of thing, rather than positing, an external source for motion and order. This means that ontology is cosmology or even biology. So they're not looking for some external cause like a first being or a God. They explain everything as Zeran, as it is the way it is. It is the way it is. So it is spontaneous. Now, secondly, the second assumption is that if it is spontaneous, if the generation is spontaneous, the very nature of being, meaning if spontaneous generation is the very nature of being, how things came about, then one can legitimately attribute Ziran as the ultimate or the things themselves, the things in themselves. Okay. So again, in Taoism, or in the Tao Te Ching rather, Lao Tzu says human beings follow earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao, Tao follows Ziran. So that means there, Ziran is higher than the Tao, the cause of the Tao. But in another chapter, he also speaks the Ziran of the myriad of things. And then in another chapter, he says the people refer to their own Ziran. Ziran, again, is the self-so, meaning it's spontaneous, the thing in itself. Okay, so this immanence contrasts with the common division between God as a self-cause, or everything else is caused by God, or God is the first cause, the final cause, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that kind of view of God as something that is separate ultimately sees being as divided into two fundamentally different kinds. But in Chinese philosophy, as we have said, one thing follows from this, one thing follows from that, one thing follows from this, until you reach this notion of Ziran, which is actually, we can translate as the thing in itself, meaning the thing as it is caused by itself. Okay? So we go to the third point, the third commonality, that the ultimate is immanent in the world. It is immanent in the world. The ultimate, the fundamental, so one fundamental ambiguity here is that while they can be read, the different texts, while they can be read as describing something that happened in the past, so you can trace back to the past, they can just also be describing something that is ongoing, an ongoing process in which the generative function is always present. So the generation, so yes, there is spontaneous generation, and this spontaneous generation can be traced back to, you know, so the myriad of things, and then the three, and then the two, and then the one, and then the Ziran. But it could also be interpreted as that this is an ongoing process. It is a process that ongoing in the present. So in the Tao Te Ching, the Tao is always without a name. It's the unnameable. And although in its, it is so simple, heaven and earth do not dare subordinate it. It's not subordinated uh, under the notion of heaven and earth. We cannot say that the Tao is something that is external, but the Tao is uh, something. It is the Tao is something that is immanent. It is embedded in nature, and together, even when you think of the yin and yang, the wu wei, the Tao, the Ziran, it's something that is immanent in things, immanent in reality. So it's rather difficult to think of this concept as, following some kind of a succession, okay, or a kind of uh, a kind of a process with uh, distinct processes or distinct steps that we can really identify or differentiate from one another. It's rather difficult to think of the Tao as separate from the Yin Yang, because the Yin Yang is part of the Tao, and the Tao is integrated into the Ziran, etc. Okay, so since the self so spontaneity, meaning the Ziran, this uh, to which Tao refers, is always present, what is required is a negative process of removing obstacles. Chiran is what remains if we free ourselves from striving and from our conventional goals. Thus, this same process is described as the Wu Wei, which literally means lacking action, but it refers to giving up actions that are coercive, forced, artificial, uh, unnatural, etc. So there is, just to go back to this point, there is a kind of immanence. Okay? It's a kind of immanence. It's kind of an ongoing process. Although we can say that we can trace back as one thing caused the other, one thing caused the other, but it's not the way uh, we understand it in Western philosophy. Like, for example, in the case of the principle of causality, that the effect is different from the cause, and the effect can never be higher than the cause, etc., etc. It does not work. Does not work that way. Now, the last commonality is that between the ultimate and myriad concrete of things, the multiplicity between the ultimate, or it could be the Tao or it could be the Ziran, and the multiplicity of things, there are intermediary steps, particularly a role for polarities and cyclical patterns. So now we go now to the cycles. All of the cosmogonies, positive stages between the ultimate and the concrete multiplicity of things, which we find in the physical world. If the ultimate ground of things is immanent rather than teleological or something that is separate, then concrete things must be explained through a gradual process of spontaneous differentiation. So this is a kind of metaphysics that again does not look for an external cause or a first being, but the basic principles of reality are contained in reality itself. So having a series of stages also allows for degrees of differentiation within a connected whole. And that provides an explanation not just for the concrete multiplicity of things, but also for nature as a system, as kind of a whole. We go back to the idea of Lao Tzu that we have to view the universe, the cosmos, holistically, okay? Because there is a harmony, a unity within the cosmos. Now, the most common stage involves interaction between two forces. This is the polar forces, which could be specified in many ways. Like, for example, the polarity between heaven and earth, okay? Between hot and cold, between dry and moist, between what day and night. Okay, even when say knowledge and ignorance, etc. But the pair that came to dominate, of course, this polarity is the notion of the yin and yang. All of the cosmogonies include cycles and process of return to this. So remember our discussion on the notion of relative opposites. Okay? And remember also the the invariables. One of the invariables is the reversion, the notion of reversion, meaning the process of return. You go to the extreme, then it goes back to the other extreme. Okay, but they're not. So they are not really totally, absolutely opposite. That you cannot go from one to the other. That heaven and earth are totally opposite because they are just these are just relative opposites. Okay. Now, one prominent model of this, cycle and polarity is the notion of the four seasons. The change of seasons places the cycle of growth and decay into a broader context of continuous vitality. The changing of the seasons. So the changing of the seasons itself, though was seen as expressing a more fundamental cycle between poles, uh, is actually an expression of the of the yin and the yang. Cyclical change could also be theorized through the progression of generation. generation, overcoming among the five phases. Like, for example, the five phases of wood, then earth, then fire, air, and metal. So that's how uh, these cosmogonies, explain the nature of reality in the Chinese thought. Now, let's move on now to Confucius. Of course, we know Confucius to be one of the central and leading figures in Chinese philosophy. Um, he was born in Nishan, a town in central China. His family is named Kong, and his personal name is Chu. But he is referred to as either Kong Chu or Kung Fu Chu, meaning Master Kong or Teacher Kong, uh, throughout Chinese philosophy or Chinese history. And he is, of course, regarded as the first great teacher of China. He was raised and instructed by his mother, and he distinguished himself as, a diligent and a very tireless learner. And he has mastered the six arts of ritual, music, archery, charioting, calligraphy, and arithmetic. And he was familiar with the classical tradition, with poetry and history. So Confucius is a great scholar, a great teacher. And around 520 before the Common Era, he established a school to teach others how to govern. And this is called the Chu School, or the School of the Literati. And the curriculum of the school is focused on writing, mathematics, music, ritual, archery, and charioting. Pretty much you know, the the classical, the classic. Uh, of course, he has written quite a number of books. But of course, one of the more one of the most important uh, writings of Confucius, which contains the sayings and ideas, and that sums up his philosophy, is the Lunyu, or the Analects. Okay. Anyway, so that's about Confucius. Let's go to his ideas. Uh, Confucius emphasized morality over practical skills. Okay? And he cultivated an informal teaching style that seems to have included many question and answer sessions. You can see this in many of the writings of Lao Tzu or Confucius, where he conversed with his uh, with his students. Okay. So, of course, Lao Tzu, or Confucius answers pupils' question, this often came in the form of brief but memorable sayings. So he wanted his teachers or his students or disciples to be more than just literati or scholars. Wanted them to be well-rounded men who are not only literate but also useful in the society or in the state. He was concerned about the total development of his disciples and, of course, of the people. According to him, personal development and cultivation happen in the context of human relationships, particularly in society. So we have to be uh, a fully developed person, like some kind of a sage. The sage is more than just a literati or a learned man. He's a well-rounded man. He's not only literate, but he's also useful and a big contributor to the welfare of the state or the society. Okay. Now, so Well, we can talk about ethics, but if you want to know about the ethics of the Confucian ethics, I have a separate lecture or video on Confucian ethics. But let's focus on the concept of the universe according to the Confucian philosophy. The and this is based on the notion of, again, the way of heaven or the mandate of heaven and the way of man. The Confucian concept of the universe or the cosmos is structured around the three powers, or what we can call the ultimates of the cosmos. And these are heaven or Tian, and then earth or Di, and the human person, Ren. Chan, Di, and Ren. These three work together in an organic cosmos. Hence, these three are the origin of things in Confucian philosophy. It is heaven that generates things, it is the earth that nourishes them, and it is the humans who perfect them. So these three share the same nature, and their relationship is characterized by harmony rather than opposition. So remember again, you go back to Taoism about relative opposite, okay, the relation of the yin and the yang. And of course, you can refer back to the to what we have discussed previously about the immanence. Okay. Um, in the Book of Changes, they are regarded as the three modes of the same way, or the three modes of the Tao, okay? And the way of the heaven, and the way of the earth. So these are three modes of way, the same Tao, same way of heaven, and the same way of the earth. Okay, and the way, of course, of the human, okay? Humanness and righteousness, etc. So the Tao is fundamental to Chinese view of the universe, and it is found in other Chinese philosophies, like of course in Taoism. So it's something that is common to all of them. The Confucians focus on how to apply the principles governing heaven and earth to man and society in order to maintain the harmony of the cosmos. So the Tao, or the way, originate from the heaven, and earth is the source of the meaning and value of human life. It is the source of the harmony in the universe, the peace in society, and the good life. And man has the duty to practice the way in his own way. Hence, it cannot be separated from human life and conduct. So, heaven has many interpretations, but in the moral context, it is the source of the ethical principles and the supreme sanction of human behavior. Man is answerable to the heaven with regard to fulfilling his duty and destiny. And this also includes the society and the rulers of the government. They will So man is answerable to the heavens with regard to fulfilling his duty and destiny. And this mandate includes the society, or it includes the rulers of the government. They will also be answerable to heaven from where they receive their mandate. So we go back to what we have discussed before, right? So it is heaven that regulates human affairs and conducts and commands each one to practice humanness, righteousness, propriety, filial piety, etc. And any wrongdoing or evil action or violation of the moral principles will eventually corrected and punished by heaven itself, which is closely watching the world below. Hence, it is a serious offense to violate the way of heaven. In the Analects, Confucius warned that he who offends against heaven has nobody to pray to. Hence, it is an unfortunate fate to be abandoned by heaven. So, as a source of moral principles, heaven is also the source of moral virtues. Heaven can generate and bring out moral virtues in man because it is the ultimate principle of transcendence. And because of its generating power, heaven can also confer on man his moral nature and he can follow and develop the way in his own nature in different ways. Man, therefore, has the capacity to cultivate his nature according to the way of heaven. And the cultivation of the way is the principle governing the Confucian teaching on instruction. Now, although it is said that Confucius was blessed abundantly by heaven, Confucius, however, sometimes also doubted that heaven has a greater influence on our daily life. So he said that heaven does, he asked, does heaven speak? The four seasons pursue their courses, and all things are continually being produced. But heaven does not say anything. Now, what is the point of Confucius in saying that? We go back to what we have said before, that it is really dependent or up to man to develop the virtues. And if he will develop his virtues, then he will be rewarded by heaven. So the way of heaven and the way of the earth and the way of man, they explain the reality, the nature of reality in Confucian philosophy. So that's the end of this rather long lecture. And thank you very much for listening. Stay safe.